What happened to berries? What was once a competitive mainstay that was the most consistent item on your team, to what is now just a glittering pickup item on the ground that does virtually nothing. Berries are a staple part of Pokemon both casually and in the more competitive environment. Things like Citrus Berry, keeping your Pokemon alive and a crucial part of a battle, to making beauty blocks to evolve your elusive Feebas in Pokemon Emerald. I love berries. I think they're awesome. From recovering HP, healing status conditions, erasing EVs, and just being really cool designs that add some flavor to the Pokemon world, they're some of the most unique and interesting items we have at our disposal. Today, I wanted to go over the history of berries from a competitive lens, how they got here, what they do, how we use them, and how they kind of just disappeared save maybe for a handful of berries that we use now. I bet there are players out there that don't even know some of these berries exist, so I wanted to shine some light and grow the knowledge base. I also just love berries, and I wanted to make a video about them. Before we get into all that, if you could take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, it would mean the world to me. As the channel grows, so does the quality of my content. I'm a one-man crew here, and doing this is an act of love for me to the community that I belong to. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Berries were introduced in Generation 2 to take advantage of the newly introduced Held Items feature. This change to Pokemon really added a new dimension to Pokemon battles that wasn't available in Generation 1. Players were now able to effectively provide a passive advantage to the Pokemon that didn't require a fifth move. Included with all the new Held Item possibilities were the subjects of our video today. 10 berries were added as consumable items that worked once per battle. While rudimentary in names and without any real sprites to speak of, these were definitely outshined by the apricorns that were also added to the game. I would say it's a pretty safe assumption that most people were hoping to get more apricorns than berries back in the day to get more curveballs. The list of berries available in Generation 2 is short, so I'll list them all here. Bear with me, as some of these names don't translate very well due to the limitations of the Game Boy. PRZ Cure Berry, which cures paralysis. The Mint Berry, which cures sleep. The PSN Cure Berry, which cures poison. The Ice Berry, which cures burn. The Burnt Berry, which cures freeze. The Mystery Berry, which restores 5 PP. The Berry, which restores 10 HP. The Bitter Berry, which cures confusion. The Miracle Berry, which cures any non-volatile status condition and confusion. And the Gold Berry, which restores 30 HP. Because VGC as we know it didn't begin until the 4th generation, I'm going to talk about the singles metagame for the first couple generations. Generation 2's singles metagame revolved around very bulky Pokemon that were hard to take down. The DV and stat experience mechanic that Generations 1 and 2 used to determine a Pokemon's stats worked very differently to the IVs and EVs that we all use today. The DV and stat experience mechanic allows all Pokemon to max out their stats with a total of 65,535 stat experience for each stat, meaning every Pokemon had max offense and max defense at the same time. This allows for a slow slugfest of a metagame where each Pokemon was holding leftovers. The only viable berry in GOC singles was the Miracle Berry, as a proto-Lum Berry, that would allow your Snorlax to curse its little heart out and then click rest to fully heal itself of any status condition and immediately wake up, or heal any other status condition that could affect your Pokemon. This followed very similar logic to the Lum Berry usage that we'll see later in the video. In general, leftovers tended to be a more consistent item and was basically on every Pokemon because at this time, it was the best and most reliable item in the game. This was okay though, as this time it was rather difficult to get the berries. As far as accessibility goes, each berry tree in GSC could only produce one berry a day, which wasn't the most accessible. You had to wait an entire day to get the next berry, and it wasn't until you had free roam of the map, fly, and both regions unlocked that you could get all the berries accessible to you. Generation 3 would really take berries to the next level and harvest a much better use of them, and held items as a whole. Berries got a huge overhaul in Generation 3, to where they will begin to play as we all know them, a consumable item with some very good once per battle benefit that could make or break a game. Berries were a powerful inclusion to the metagame in Generation 3, and the first 10 berries were effectively reskins of the original 10 berries from GSC, now with better names, a parallel to a real fruit motif that continues on today, and more useful boosts than the previous generation, making them a lot more useful in battle. The PRZ Cure Berry became the Cherry Berry, the Mint Berry became the Chesto Berry, the PSN Cure Berry became the Pecha Berry, the Ice Berry became the Rost Berry, the Burnt Berry became the Asper Berry, the Mystery Berry became the Lepa Berry, the Berry became the Oran Berry, the Bitter Berry became the Person Berry, the Miracle Berry became the Lum Berry, the Gold Berry, which originally restored 30 HP, is now known as the Citrus Berry, and this became the staple berry that we all know and love today. It restores 25% of a Pokemon's HP when its HP falls below 50%. In addition to the reskins and reworks of the first 10 berries, 23 new berries were added to the game. Some of these did absolutely nothing, while others were important strategic tools for players wanting to spice things up in battle. Well, I guess maybe they didn't do absolutely nothing. They could still be used to make Pokeblocks for the contest in Generation 3, and to evolve Feebas, but within the context that I'm talking about today, they mostly did nothing. Generation 3 also added the following 6 berries that each had their utility in the competitive environment. Palmeg berries that would lower HP EVs, Kelpsy berries that would lower attack EVs, Fallout berries that would lower defense EVs, Hondu berries that lower special attack EVs, the Grappa berries that would lower special defense EVs, and the Tomato berries that would lower speed EVs. This would be important to players that could only get one competitively viable Pokemon at a time. You'll remember that this was before the time of guaranteed IP Pokemon. At this time, if you were lucky enough to find a Pokemon with perfect IVs, you were talking about a very lucky encounter. If I had 5 IV Tyranitar that I wanted to re-EV, I'd have to farm up these berries over time, and I mean plant them, water them, wait for them to fully mature, and then harvest them, and feed enough of them to the Tyranitar to reset everything back down to 0 to start over. A tedious and arduous task to say the least, but at the time, this was how it was done. There were also 5 berries that would interweave themselves with a new ability mechanic that were some of the more interesting strategies. These 5 berries would raise a stat by 1 stage when the user fell below 25 HP. Those berries were the Lychee berry that raised attack, the Ganlon berry that raised defense, the Salac berry that raised speed, the Pitaya berry that raised special attack, and the Apricot berry that raised special defense. While now these seem trivial, at the time these berries would enable some of the strongest attacks in the game. I will also mention the introduction of what we call the 33% berries, which heal a Pokemon's HP by 25%. These weren't as relevant competitively until Generation 7, where they would be buffed to heal a Pokemon by 50%, barring the nature wasn't one that caused confusion when healed. These were the Figgy berry, the Wiki berry, the Aguav berry, the Mago berry, and the Ayapapa berry. We'll talk about these later in the video when they become more relevant. For now, I want to talk about some of the more notable strategies that came from these new berries because they're rather nostalgic for me and it brings me back to a much simpler time in Pokemon. Many physical attackers such as Tyranitar would get absolutely neutralized by a well-timed Will-O-Wisp, and then would effectively turn into dead weight that would maybe flinch every now and then with a Rock Slide. Lumberry, being the new Miracle Berry, would get rid of any status condition, notably burns, that could stop a Dragon Dancing Tyranitar from sweeping away to victory. Lumberry's effectiveness would not stop burns, but any status condition that would stop a Pokemon's efficaciousness. You got Spored? Lumberry. Will-O-Wisp? Lumberry. Thunderwave? Lumberry. A very effective item and one that will continue to pop up again and again on some of the best teams ever made. Citrus Berry, being the new Gold Berry, is the one that I know you all love. Seeing many placements on teams and a staple on the bulkiest of Pokemon like Amoonguss or Incineroar at the time of making this video. A great item, effectively making any Pokemon holding it 25% bulkier. This item single-handedly turns 2-hit KOs to 3-hit KOs. This also allows Pokemon with recoil moves like Double Edge or Flare Blitz or Head Smash to be able to hit those powerful recoil moves more times in a battle. While this berry didn't get as much usage in Generation 3 as the others on this list, it will be back again and again for the rest of the video and probably beyond. Generation 4 introduced 21 new berries to those from Generation 3 for a total of 64 berries. Many of the mechanics surrounding the growth of berries was improved to facilitate the use of the new berries, by increasing the yield of the berry trees, how quickly they grow, and items that could be used to increase the speed at which you harvest them. In Heart Gold Soul Silver, no soil was present, and instead the berry pot key item allowed players to grow berries anywhere they went, which honestly, I kind of wish we had in real life. Can you imagine carrying a plant like this everywhere with its own light and stuff? I think it's a cool idea. Competitive Pokemon would take advantage of the new berries that reduced the super effective damage taken after consuming one. This included a berry for each super effective hit, excluding normal type, as it's not super effective against anything, and excluding the Roselli berry, as the fairy type was not a thing back then. Back then, there was no open team sheet like there is today, and this has allowed for many viable strategies that might catch your opponents off guard. My favorite memory is using a Gyarados to bait in electric moves only to switch in and surprise my opponent with a Motor Drive boost on my Expert Belt Electivire and start sweeping from there. This was around the time that I got into competitive Pokemon, and a lot of this is very nostalgic for me. You can imagine just how impactful a lot of the new berries would be, allowing Pokemon that would normally go down in one hit, able to take a turn to either set up a Swords Dance, Dragon Dance, or any other stat boosting move and effectively sweep the game from behind. Some of the more notable strategies from this time period were things like Yache Berry Garchomp. Yache Berry Garchomp allowed it to live some moves like Ice Shard from Mamoswine or Ice Punch from Weavile and do immense power back, breaking their focus sashes and sometimes even getting a knockout when they were already weakened. Or a Habon Berry could be used to reduce incoming Draco Meteors from its cousin Salamence. This meant that Garchomp's usual checks had to be very careful around this kind of set. I think the best example of the use of the super effective berries was Heatran. Heatran was one of the brand new Pokemon from this generation, and it came in bringing in the heat. Players had to contend with its flexibility and what items it could be holding. Its bulk was impressive, and made it even bulkier when holding any of the damage-reducing berries. Pasho Berry gave it a better matchup into some of the bulky waters. Shoka Berry gave it better matchups into things like Garchomp, and Citrus Berry would allow it to survive even longer if its opponents didn't have a way to OHKO it. Heatran was one of the better options for running some of these berries, and it could very easily take advantage of an unsuspecting opponent and KO back with ease. 2009 was the first year we saw a VGC World Championship, and we can see some of these berries really impact the way that this finals game plays out. By the way, the footage for some of these earlier VGC finals matches are a bit rough, but looks so cool when it's all up on Battle Revolution. Sometimes I wish we still had a Pokemon Stadium type of game for us to really battle in HD. I think since the jump to 3D graphics, we just haven't had as good of a game as Battle Revolution for us to battle in. It makes the battles so much more exciting to watch in my opinion. Maybe one day we'll get Pokemon Stadium 3. Also, some of the team sheets are very hard to find for the earlier years of Pokemon VGC, so bear with me as we go through the footage and try to spec out the items as we find them. Looking at this match, we can see a Citrus Berry activate on Kazuyuki Tsuji's Salamence after taking a rock slide from Tasuku Mano's Rhyperior in Game 1 of the 2009 World Championships. We also see a Lumberry on Empoleon healing a paralysis in Game 2, and a Custap Berry goes off on the Snorlax, showing just how important it was to run items like this to compete at the highest levels of play. The use of berries really went from an offensive threat in Generation 3 to a defensive item in Generation 4, allowing players to build more consistent teams that would last longer in battle, and reduce the risk of not activating strategies like Salac Berry, really cementing these damage reduction berries and stat boosting berries as VGC mainstays and planting themselves into everyone's teams as must-have items for patching up some of the worst matchups. In 2010, we can see a Chopo Berry on Ray Rizzo's Dialga to help survive the low kick from Tyranitar in Game 1 of 2010 VGC World Championships. This would have brought Ray's Dialga down to much lower HP and not have been able to break the substitute on Midori's Palkia the turn after. We also see Cresselia's Citrus Berry activate on Ray's Cresselia to stay on the battlefield and continue supporting Ray Rizzo's team to eventually win the World Championships in Games 2 and 3. Citrus Berry and Chopo Berry were instrumental to Ray's team staying on the battlefield longer to get off even just one more Earthquake or Rock Slide or Dragon Pulse to put it in a game-winning position. How many times have you thought to yourself, if I could only live one more turn? There were many combinations of berries on Pokemon, and I could go on. Things like Chopo Berry Tyranitar, Aqua Berry Scizor, or Walken Berry Gyarados all allowed Pokemon that were once completely checked by a super effective move to live and KO back under the right circumstances. Generation 4 berry usage would change competitive Pokemon as a whole for many years, and would really skyrocket in the 5th generation. Generation 5 would introduce a new consumable item in the form of gems for berries to compete with. These gems would boost a move by 50%, and were definitely in contention as one of the most broken items ever made. This was also the generation that Unnerve was released in as an ability that could stop opposing Pokemon from activating any sort of berry that any Pokemon was holding. A worrisome ability to say the least, however the distribution of which wasn't as good as it could have been. Despite this, we saw teams of the World Championships with up to 4 berries. Generation 5 was really the generation where one-time use consumable items would shine, as trainers would give so many of these items to their Pokemon to hold. Berries were everywhere at the highest levels of play, right alongside gems. Just look at some of the top 8 teams in VGC 2011, 2012, and 2013. Ray Rizzo, the king of VGC in my opinion, would use up to 4 damage reduction berries on his 2011 team to take home the victory this year. You can see the Citrus Berry Gothitelle to stay on the battlefield longer, the Charty Berry Thundurus to reduce incoming rock slides from opposing Terrakions, the Chopo Berry Hydreigon to protect against Conkeldurs and Terrakions, and the Aqua Berry Escavalier to help against Volcarona. This was a state of play at the time where the damage reduction berries were always in contention with the damage boosting gems, and whoever could conserve their items the longest would get the upper hand in damage rolls throughout the tournament runs. In 2012, we can see Ray Rizzo again taking the World Championship with 4 berries on his team. The Citrus Berry on a very bulky Cresselia, the Lumberry on a Metagross, a strategy we often see with strong physical attackers, a Habon Berry on Garchomp to protect against other dragon types that were rampant in these years, and Chopo Berry on Tyranitar to help it against the other large fighting type threats like Terrakion and Conkeldurr this generation. These choices would allow Ray Rizzo to take his 3rd World Championship in a row, and really goes to show how important these berries were to VGC for many years, enabling the consistency and reliability needed to play at the top of the ladder. Generation 5 would round out its years as the VGC battlefield with a team from Arash Omadi that would dominate the 2013 VGC World Championships, this time opting for Citrus Berry on Conkeldurr, and interestingly, a Lumberry on Amoonguss, presumably to stop other Amoonguss from sporing it, as in this generation Spore still hit opposing grass types. Just another way that the power of these berries would continue to be one of the best choices for held items. Before we move on to Generation 6, I wanted to talk about the way that players had access to these berries because it was strange. See, back then, Pokemon was finally getting into the online space, and the Dream World was a way that Game Freak experimented with things including the hidden abilities of Pokemon and farming berries in this cloud-based virtual simulator. Players could grow and harvest these berries every so often. However, I think this might have been ahead of its time. I grew up in a rather rural part of the US at the time, and I remember my DS just not working very well with the Dream World until I went off to college. Maybe I'm just bitter because my internet sucked for so long, but really, why not just put these berries in the game? Why make it so difficult on players, especially with how obviously important these items were at the time? Anyway, let's move on to Generation 6. Generation 6 would only introduce one new berry, the Roselli berry, to round out the damage reduction berries that include the new fairy type. This was sometimes seen on Pokemon like Hydreigon to take on some of the weaker Dazzling Gleams running around, but otherwise wasn't as effective against powerful threats like Mega Gardevoir, Mega Mawile, or Sylveon. Generation 6 would be the first time that the winning team for the World Championships did not have a large amount of berries present, seeing only the Citrus Berry on the Pachirisu that we all rooted for to win the 2014 World Championships. Suddenly, the use of these berries would start to show their age. With Mega Evolution taking up a slot and sometimes changing the Pokemon's type altogether, the amount of berries that would show up in this generation began to falter. 2015 had about 2 berries on the winning team. However, this was the year of Chalk, where Heatran was basically mandatory on all teams. This made Shuckberry a reliable soft counter to other Heatrans for the mirror match, which was basically every match. The Citrus Berry on Cresselia once again shows us how consistent this item was on a bulky Pokemon that wanted to stay on the battlefield for a long period of time. The use of the damage reduction berries wasn't as relevant during this because of the over-centralization of the metagame on one team, and therefore you weren't having to prepare for that many threats. In 2016, Wolf Glick piloted a team that only had one berry on it, the Lumberry, on his Bronzong to take the 2016 World Championships and rocket ship him up to stardom. This was actually the second time he was in the World Championship Finals, with the first being back in 2012 when he lost to Ray Rizzo. This Lumberry would give his team better matchups into Amoonguss and protected against burns that would really reduce the damage of his Gyro Balls in her Trick Room. I do want to take a minute to talk about how X and Y handled berry farming in this generation though, because it was the most fun it's ever been, and I loved it. Basically, you had a farm that was just south of the daycare in X and Y that you could plant any sort of berry you wanted, and if you planted one berry next to another compatible berry with the right mulch, you could crossbreed them to get new berries, and that was how you collected almost all the berries. This was honestly so much fun at the time, and I remember having timers on my phone to remind me to go water my berries and harvest them. I would get so excited, and I wish this was the way we always handle berries from now on. However, that wish will not be granted. Generation 7 would see the introduction of another favorable consumable item in seeds. There would be one for each terrain that would activate it: the Psychic Seed, Electric Seed, Grassy Seed, and Misty Seed. And due to the Tapus being great terrain setters, the seeds added another item for berries to compete with as their item of choice on most VGC players' teams. They did, however, boost the 33% berries to heal 50% of your HP when you drop down to 25% of your health, being effectively a backup citrus berry, albeit a little riskier. You'd have to also keep in mind the nature of your Pokemon, as that would determine whether or not you'd be confused after being healed. 2017 would be the first time that berries were completely absent from the World Championship winning team. With them competing with Z Crystals and Seeds, the World Championship team for this year, piloted by Ryota Otsubo, would have absolutely no berries on it. No Citrus Berry or Lumberry even. Instead opting for 2 Z Crystals for more offensive pressure. A key piece of that strategy was Normalium Z, which would make your Nature Power a priority Fairy or Electric nuke. This surely was a change from previous years, as Hyper Offense seemed to dominate the normally balanced strategies. 2018 saw the return of Mega Evolution, Tapus, Intimidate Incineroar, and Z Crystals. The world-winning team saw 2 berries come back, with Generation 7 boosting the effectiveness of the 33% berries. Aguav Berry and Figgy Berry were the recovery berries of choice this time around. Something to note about this year was that 4 of the 6 items on this team were consumable, showing similarities to the year 2012. Gluttony was preferred on Snorlax as it allowed it to use its berry early even. Generation 7 would conclude with the most powerful metagame that we've ever seen, and with it came one berry to save them all, Culver Berry, which would be used on the Lunala to give it a better matchup against all the Incineroars running around and trying to hit it for super effective dark type attacks. This was crucial to the win of the 2019 World Championships, and the berries continue to be a VGC staple even in the most powerful metagame ever. Getting these berries was a bit of a chore in Generation 7 though, with the berry trees being more of a random drop than anything else. You could eventually farm berries in Poképelago, but it wasn't nearly as fun as X and Y was, and as I said before, I kinda dropped out of Pokemon in Generation 7, so I don't remember much about the post-game, but from what I gather, it wasn't as fun or interesting as the way X and Y handled berries. With the pandemic, we missed out on what could have been 2 very interesting years of World Championships. I remember playing some of this metagame though, at least at the beginning when Dracovish was the biggest headache for most players. The Rindo Berry on Gastrodon and the Babiri Berry on Togekiss were huge picks for taking on some of the more powerful Dynamax moves that were coming our way. Something interesting would happen once we did get the World Championships back, however, and that was the use of As-1 as an ability on Calyrex Shadow. This was the combination of Unnerve, an ability introduced in Generation 5 to try to stop the rampant use of berries, and Spectrier's ability Grim Neigh, which boosts its special attack stat for every KO it gets. Something of a special Moxie boost. So why did Game Freak combine it with Unnerve? Well, negating the bulk that berries would give was very effective at increasing the chances of Grim Neigh to activate. I attribute this ability to having a huge impact on the way berries were used in this metagame, and how this team won Worlds in 2022. This was the kind of ability that would lessen the usage of these berries during these years, and led to much less bulky teams overall. Sure, Dynamax would add HP, but didn't necessarily reduce the damage taken the way a Koba Berry or Roselli Berry would. The accessibility of these berries took a hit as well with the introduction of an NPC that reset your stats. Suddenly the EV berries didn't mean anything anymore, so that's even less berry usage than we had originally described. In-game, berry trees are annoying, as you have to battle this little rodent over and over again when trying to get the berries you're after, and it's not even guaranteed which one you're gonna get. I'm not sure what Game Freak has against all these berries, but it couldn't get much worse, right? And that leads us to Generation 9 and my initial thoughts when I got the idea to make this video. What happened to berries? They were such a staple and consistent part of the World Championship winning teams, allowing players to outlive their opponent despite their optimal plays, and giving a bit of a cushion to their game plan. Well, terrestrialization would change the way we play. Super effective berries would be very good if we weren't changing our types into immunities or resistances in every battle. This leads to awkward situations where a Shuka Berry on, say, a Raging Bolt would have been very good and consistent had it not been for the ability to terrestrialize into a fairy type to help with its resistances. We've had one World Championship so far in Generation 9, and with it we saw the Citrus Berry once again being the gold standard and on the bulkiest of Pokemon Amoonguss. While this is great and goes to show how strong Citrus Berry is as an item, it's nowhere near the amount of usage that we used to see back in the day before terrestrialization. Most of the berries are obsolete, bar a few Figgy Berries on Incineroar sometimes. Not only that, but the mechanics of getting these berries has been reduced to literally any other item. Even the rarest and most coveted berries have been reduced to twinkles on the ground that barely register anymore. No ways of resetting your EVs by farming the berries, but instead replaced by Ogre Ousting, which gives you a chance of getting fresh start mochis, instead of a reliable way to reset your Pokemon for different builds. While yes, this is the easiest it's ever been to make a whole new competitive battle ready Pokemon, it makes me a little sad to see the use of these berries be reduced to basically only 2, sometimes 3. Good old Citrus Berry, the reskin of the Gold Berry from GST continues to be a consistent item, and the 33% berries continue to be a backup to the Citrus Berry when Item Clause doesn't allow for 2 Citrus Berries. This is interesting for a few reasons to me. Let's say for a moment that terrestrialization becomes an evergreen mechanic, which I honestly hope it does. If Pokemon could forever terrestrialize, I think it'd make for some really interesting VGC metagames down the line, and honestly, I'd welcome the change. This would, however, leave a lot of these berries basically useless, unless we decide to double up on changing type and then surviving a super effective hit after terrestrializing. This seems very complicated though and unlikely to happen. Even in game, the berry trees are gone, and berry farming is non-existent, and all we're left with is a consolation prize of a new mythical Pokemon based on the Pecha Berry, Run. How cool would it have been if instead of the apple orchards in the DLC, it was berry farming again? Sure, I think most players probably didn't care as much as me, but I miss Generation 6's berry farming mechanics. That was such a fun time for me, and I wish we could bring it back. Are we really leaving berries to be random picks on the ground from now on? To me, berries were an interesting way to world build around the Pokemon world. Items that were useful in battle, outside of battle, throughout your playthrough of the story, in Pokemon contests, in Poffins, in Pokeblocks, in Curry, and as another fun way to maybe have a bit of a farming simulator minigame. But most of that is gone now. The jump from Generation 8 to 9 really killed a lot of that for us, and I wonder where this will take us in the future. If you have some ideas, by all means let me know in the comments. This is all I have to say for now. If you enjoyed the video and stuck around to the end, let me know what you think about berries, and how the use of them has really fallen off this generation. Would you like the farming simulator back, or are you happy that they're gone? Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more videos from PoxxVGC. Until next time.